He said it in front of the wrong person. Los Angeles, 1959, a conference room at Capitol Records on Vine Street. 8 people around the table, producers, label executives, managers, and 2 men whose names appeared on the marquees of every major venue in America. The meeting had been called to discuss Dean Martin's upcoming album, sales projections, marketing positioning, the standard language of the music industry dressed up as partnership and mutual investment. For 40 minutes, it had been exactly that. Numbers reviewed, release dates confirmed, promotional strategies outlined by men who understood the business of music without necessarily understanding music itself. Then the executive spoke. His name was Richard Alderman, 41 years old, head of artist relations at Capitol since 1955, a man who had built a reputation for delivering difficult assessments with a professional smoothness that management had found useful and artists had found, over the years, varying degrees of tolerable. He looked at Dean Martin across the mahogany table. Frankly, Dean, the trajectory has been concerning. The last 2 records underperformed against projections. The demographic data suggests a market that's shifting away from the traditional sound you've built your career on. He paused, the practiced pause of a man who has rehearsed the phrasing enough to know where the pause should go. Maybe it's time to have a realistic conversation about where this is heading, about what adjustments look like going forward. He said it with the particular confidence of a man who believed he was performing a service, delivering truth that others had been too polite to say. He had looked at Dean when he said it, held eye contact, the way people do when they want you to understand they mean what they're saying. He had not looked to his left. 2 seats to Dean Martin's left, Frank Sinatra had been sitting quietly for the better part of an hour. Sinatra was 43 years old. He had spent the previous 6 years rebuilding a career that had been written off in the early 1950s and was now, by any measurable standard, at its absolute peak. His relationship with Capitol Records was the most commercially successful artist-label partnership of the decade. His opinion in that room, and in most rooms that mattered in Los Angeles in 1959, was not merely important, it was the room's center of gravity. He said nothing when Alderman finished speaking. He looked at Alderman with an expression that people who knew Sinatra well would have recognized immediately as significant. Not anger. Anger was visible, performable, something that could be pointed to afterward and used as explanation. This was something quieter and therefore more durable. The expression of a man who has heard something he intends to remember and who understands that the appropriate response to the situation is not in this room, not in this moment, and not in any form that would allow the person responsible to see it coming or prepare for it. A colleague who had been present, a woman named Patricia Keene, who worked in Capitol's A&R department and had attended the meeting in support capacity, said later that she had watched Sinatra's face when Alderman spoke and had understood, in the way that people who work closely around powerful men learn to understand things, that something had been decided. It wasn't a look of anger, Patricia said in a conversation with a music journalist years later. It was a look of clarity, like he'd just been told something he needed to know. Dean Martin, for his part, responded to Alderman the way Dean Martin responded to almost anything that tried to diminish him, with a calm that didn't invite further engagement and didn't reveal what it cost to maintain. He thanked Alderman for the feedback, said he'd consider what adjustments made sense, said it without inflection, without the kind of visible reaction that would have given Alderman anything useful to read. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Other topics were covered. The room returned to the professional register that had characterized its first 40 minutes. Then it ended. Richard Alderman drove home that evening with the feeling of a man who has done his job. He had said the difficult thing. He had been professional about it. He had, in his own estimation, demonstrated the kind of honest engagement that separated serious music industry professionals from the ones who told artists what they wanted to hear. He had not noticed Sinatra's expression when he finished speaking. He had not, in that moment, understood that Frank Sinatra being in the room was not incidental. The following week passed normally. Alderman attended his scheduled meetings, fielded his calls, moved through the ordinary rhythms of his position. The week after that, something small changed. A meeting that was on his calendar was rescheduled, then rescheduled again, then quietly removed without explanation. A call he was expecting from a producer at a partner label was returned by an assistant rather than the producer himself. Minor things, the kind of administrative friction that existed in every large organization and usually signified nothing. By the fourth week, the friction had texture. 2 projects he had expected to lead were assigned to other executives without discussion of why the assignments had shifted. A dinner that he had been included in for the past 3 years was organized without him being contacted. When he asked about it, the explanation was vague. Scheduling conflict, limited table size, nothing personal. He began asking around, carefully, in the way that you ask around when you are beginning to understand that something is happening but cannot yet identify its shape. What he could not find was a point of origin. No single conversation that had gone wrong, no policy change, no visible reason, just the slow and steady closing of doors that had previously been open, without anyone being impolite enough to tell him why they were closing. Richard Alderman was let go from Capitol Records at the end of his 6th week after the conference room meeting. The official language was restructuring, a reorganization of the Artist Relations Department that made his specific role redundant. He was given 3 months of severance and a letter of reference that was technically positive and practically meaningless. He spent the following weeks making the calls that a man in his position made when he found himself unexpectedly on the market, to contacts at other labels, Columbia, RCA, Decca, the smaller independents that were beginning to matter in ways the majors hadn't fully accounted for yet, to managers and producers he had worked with across 4 years at Capitol, to people who owed him the currency of returned calls and taken meetings that accumulated in any career built on relationships. The calls were returned, every one of them. Richard Alderman was not a man who had burned bridges or made enemies through carelessness. His professional reputation, insofar as it could be assessed by the people he spoke to, was solid, competent, experienced, the kind of track record that should have made him a straightforward hire. The meetings were taken. Conversations happened. Interest was expressed with the warmth of people who meant it in the moment and were not consciously deciding against him. And then, consistently, nothing followed. Projects he was suited for were filled with people with less relevant experience. Positions that seemed to match his background closed quietly, without becoming formal openings he could apply for. A label that had seemed genuinely interested went silent after a second conversation, without explanation and without the courtesy of a final no. The pattern had no visible center. He could not identify a person who was working against him because no single person was. What was working against him was something more diffuse and therefore more complete. The collective withdrawal of the goodwill that had previously made his professional world function. Not organized, not coordinated in any way he could trace, just the natural consequence of what happens when the people who shape a particular world have, separately and without consultation, arrived at the same quiet conclusion about someone. Within 3 months of the conference room meeting on Vine Street, Richard Alderman was no longer a functioning part of the Los Angeles music industry. He had not been confronted, had not been given a reason he could point to or argue with, had not received a call from Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin or anyone in their orbit. There had been no campaign against him, nothing so organized or visible. Just the particular silence that falls over a man's professional life when the people whose goodwill makes it function have quietly withdrawn that goodwill. A colleague who remained at Capitol Records, a woman named Patricia Keene, who had been in the conference room that day, described what she observed in the weeks that followed. She did not speak about it publicly until years later, in a conversation with a music journalist writing a retrospective about the label's 1950s history. "I watched it happen," Patricia said, "not dramatically, just the gradual subtraction of Richard from every conversation that mattered, one meeting at a time, one introduction not made, one call not returned. It's the way things work when someone important has decided, without saying so, that a person should be somewhere else." The journalist asked her whether she believed Sinatra was responsible. Patricia considered the question carefully. "I believe Frank Sinatra was in a room where a man said something disrespectful to someone Frank considered a friend," she said. "And I believe that within 6 weeks that man was gone, and within 3 months he couldn't find work in the industry. Whether those two facts are connected, I can't say with certainty." She paused. "But I've worked in this industry for 30 years, and I've never seen a coincidence move that efficiently." Dean Martin's album released that spring and performed well, substantially better than the projections Alderman had characterized as evidence of a declining trajectory. The record reached the top 10. Its lead single spent 11 weeks on the charts. The demographic data Alderman had brought to a conference room table in 1959 as the foundation of a difficult conversation looked by the end of that year like the kind of temporary plateau that preceded the most commercially successful period of Dean Martin's career.
Whether Alderman was aware of this outcome and what he thought about it was not recorded. Frank Sinatra gave no interviews in which he mentioned Richard Alderman. Dean Martin gave no interviews in which he mentioned Richard Alderman. The story of the conference room meeting and what followed it was the kind of thing that lived in the industry's informal memory, passed between people who had been present or adjacent, told without the specificity of documentation, belonging to the category of things that everyone in a position to know about them simply knew. Richard Alderman eventually found work outside the music industry. Real estate, eventually, a career that suited his organizational skills and his ability to present difficult information with professional smoothness, and that had the advantage of existing in a world where the names Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin did not determine who returned your calls. He gave one interview in 1974 to a journalist writing a book about the Capitol Records years. The journalist asked if he had any regrets about his time at the label. Alderman was quiet for a moment. "I said something in a meeting once," he said, without paying sufficient attention to who else was in the room. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. If this story about the quiet power of loyalty and what it actually costs to disrespect the wrong person's friend moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who understands that in every room, the person who says nothing can matter more than everyone who speaks. Leave a comment about a time you realized you were talking to the wrong audience, and ring that notification bell for more stories about the moments that changed everything without anyone announcing they were changing. In 1959, a Capitol Records executive told Dean Martin his career was heading in the wrong direction in a conference room on Vine Street. Frank Sinatra was sitting 2 seats to Dean's left. Sinatra said nothing. The meeting ended. 6 weeks later, the executive was gone from Capitol Records. 3 months after that, he couldn't find work in the industry. No confrontation, no explanation, no visible reason. Just doors closing quietly, one at a time, until none of them opened anymore. The executive gave one interview about it in 1974, said he had made the mistake of saying something without paying sufficient attention to who else was in the room. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to.